The fog had swallowed Ezekiel Sullivan whole, not the kind of fog that burned off with the morning sun, thin and harmless and gone before breakfast. This was the thick, suffocating kind that rolled down from the mountains like a living thing, curling around a man's boots and climbing up his chest until it pressed against his lungs and made him feel like he was drowning while standing upright on solid ground. At least, he hoped it was solid ground. He had not been able to see his own feet for the better part of 2 hours. His horse, a big roan gelding named Corporal, had gone lame 3 miles back, maybe 4, maybe 10. Ezekiel Sullivan had stopped trusting his own sense of distance somewhere around the time the compass in his breast pocket had started spinning wildly, the needle unable to find north in the mineral-rich hills that surrounded the valley outside Redstone Creek, Colorado. The year was 1882, and Ezekiel Sullivan, deputy sheriff of Redstone Creek, was completely and utterly lost. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had survived Apache raids and cattle stampedes and more gunfights than he cared to count, that he was going to die out here. Not from a bullet or a blade, not from some dark past enemy finally catching up to him, but from the fog, from the cold, from the sheer, humiliating fact that he had ridden out after the Malone brothers without telling a single soul where he was going. And now the fog had erased every landmark he knew, and his compass was nothing but a useless spinning toy, and he could not even see the stars. He stopped walking. Corporal stopped behind him, limping on 3 legs, trusting Ezekiel the way animals trust people who have never once given them reason to doubt. "I'm sorry, boy," Ezekiel said, and his voice came back to him muffled and strange in the fog like a man speaking into cotton wool. "I got us into this." That was when he heard it, a sound, not the wind, not the distant cry of a night bird. Something deliberate and human and completely out of place in a fog-choked mountain valley at what he judged to be near midnight. A low, steady hum, almost musical, and then a voice, clear and certain as a compass needle that actually worked. "You are walking northwest," the voice said. "If you keep going that direction, you will walk off the ridge in about 40 feet. Stop moving." Ezekiel's hand went to his Colt, pure instinct. The gun cleared the holster before his brain finished processing that the voice belonged to a woman. He held very still. "I am not armed, Deputy Sullivan," the voice said, and it was closer now, emerging from the white wall of fog like something conjured. "I am not a threat, but the ridge absolutely is, so I would appreciate it if you holstered that weapon and trusted me for the next 30 seconds. He holstered the gun. A figure materialized from the fog, and Ezekiel Sullivan, who had faced down outlaws and survived a war that had tried to grind him to dust, felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. She was carrying a lantern in one hand, though the fog swallowed most of its light. In her other hand she held a brass instrument he did not recognize, small and intricate, and she was looking up not at him, but up into the white blankness of the fog-covered sky, as if she could see something there that he could not. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes, when they finally dropped from the sky to his face, were the color of strong coffee and absolutely unimpressed by him. "You are about half a mile from the main trail," she said. "The fog will thin in another 2 hours. If you follow me, you will be back in town by morning." "Who are you?" Ezekiel asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Rosa Bell," she said. "And you can thank me properly once we are clear of the ridge." He followed her. Of course he followed her. A man does not argue with someone who has just saved his life. But as he watched her move through the fog with that strange instrument raised to her eye, and that quiet certainty in every step she took, Ezekiel Sullivan felt the first dangerous stirring of something he had spent the better part of 8 years keeping firmly buried. Something that felt a great deal like fascination. He did not know yet that it would become the central fact of his life. Redstone Creek had been established along the banks of its namesake waterway in 1871, when the silver boom in the Colorado mountains had drawn fortune-seekers and families, and the kind of rough commerce that followed both. By 1882, it had grown into a genuine town, with a proper jail and a courthouse and a church and a hotel that served meals 3 times a day, and even a small school that operated in the winter months. It also had a sheriff, a man named Tom Garrett who was 62 years old and had a bad back, and trusted Ezekiel Sullivan with most of the actual work of keeping the peace. Ezekiel had come to Redstone Creek in 1879, 3 years after leaving the army and 2 years after the worst period of his life, a dark stretch of time in Abilene that he did not discuss with anyone. He was 30 years old when he pinned on the deputy's badge, broad-shouldered and lean-jawed with hands that had done hard work and eyes that had seen harder things. He was fair to the people he protected and relentless with the people who threatened them, and he had earned the respect of the town the old-fashioned way, by showing up every single day and doing what needed to be done. He did not have close friends. He had professional relationships and drinking companions, and the occasional poker game with men he liked well enough. But he had kept himself at a careful distance from anything deeper than that, because in Ezekiel Sullivan's experience, the people who mattered to you were the people who could be used against you, and the frontier was full of men who would do exactly that. He had never met Rosa Bell before the night in the fog, though he would later discover that she had been living in Redstone Creek for almost a year. She had come in the spring of 1881, arriving on the stage from Denver with 3 trunks of equipment and books and not much else. She had taken the room above the general store, negotiated directly with old Clarence Marsh for the use of a small shed behind the store that she converted into a workspace, and set herself up as a surveyor and cartographer, offering her services to the mining companies and the ranchers and anyone else who needed accurate maps of the land around Redstone Creek. The mining companies initially had laughed, not because she was incompetent. Within 3 months of her arrival, Rosa Bell had produced the most accurate survey of the Redstone Creek Valley that anyone had ever seen, accounting for terrain features and elevation changes that the previous surveys, done by men with conventional training and conventional instruments, had missed entirely. She had done it using a combination of standard surveying equipment and a method of celestial navigation that she had developed herself, an adaptation of maritime star navigation applied to land surveying, using the positions of specific stars to calculate precise coordinates in a way that conventional compass-based surveying simply could not match in the mineral-rich hills where compasses were notoriously unreliable. The mining companies had stopped laughing when her survey revealed a secondary silver vein that the previous surveys had missed, a vein that turned out to be worth more than anything else they had found in 5 years of digging. By the fall of 1881, Rosa Bell was the most sought-after surveyor within 3 counties. She worked on her own terms, charged what her services were worth, and had no patience whatsoever for the kind of men who tried to diminish what she did by questioning whether a woman could truly understand the mathematics involved. She could, as it happened, understand them better than anyone in Redstone Creek. Ezekiel Sullivan had heard her name, of course. A woman surveyor was not a thing you could ignore in a town the size of Redstone Creek. He had even seen her once or twice from a distance, a small, straight-backed figure moving through town with the purposeful stride of someone who had too much work to do and not enough hours to do it. But their paths had never crossed directly, not until the night the fog came down from the mountains and swallowed him whole. The walk back from the ridge took just over an hour. Rosa Bell moved through the fog with a confidence that was almost eerie, pausing every few minutes to raise her instrument to her eye and consult the sky above them, which to Ezekiel looked exactly like a wall of gray nothing. He could not imagine what she was seeing up there that he was not, and eventually, after the 4th such pause, his curiosity overcame his pride. "What is that instrument?" he asked. She lowered it and looked at him the way a professor looks at a student who has asked a question that is both obvious and revealing. "It is a sextant," she said, "modified from a naval design. I adjusted the arc and the index mirror to account for land-based use." "A sextant," he repeated. "That is for ships." "It was for ships," she said. "Now it is for me." She raised it again. "There is a break in the fog directly overhead, very small, maybe 6 feet across. I can see Polaris through it, and I can see the position of Jupiter relative to the horizon estimate. That gives me our bearing." Ezekiel looked up into the white wall above them and saw nothing but white wall. "You can see stars through that." "One star," she corrected, "and a planet, it is enough." He was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was 12, she said, and the way she said it was matter of fact, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "My father was a merchant sailor. He taught me celestial navigation before I could ride a horse. When I came west, I realized that compasses are nearly useless in these mineral hills and that good surveying here requires a different approach." "You applied maritime navigation to land surveying," Ezekiel said slowly. She glanced at him with what might have been mild surprise. "Yes, most people do not follow that connection so quickly." "I was Army," he said, "topographic corps for 2 years. I understand the problem with compasses in ferrous terrain." Something shifted slightly in her expression. "Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration, a reassessment. Then you know that what I am doing is not magic," she said. "It is mathematics." "I know it is mathematics," he said. "I also know that I would be at the bottom of that ridge right now if you had not been out here." "What were you doing out here exactly?" "Working," she said simply. "The fog creates a temperature inversion that lifts in specific patterns. I take readings in fog conditions to improve the accuracy of my elevation models. The fog does not bother me." She glanced at him again. "It clearly bothered you." He almost smiled. "Almost. It bothered my compass more than it bothered me." "Your compass was useless from the moment you rode into the hills east of town," she said. "The magnetite deposits there render conventional compasses unreliable for a radius of approximately 6 miles. I surveyed that zone last summer." She paused. "I mentioned it to Sheriff Garrett. I assumed he would inform his deputies." Ezekiel thought about Sheriff Tom Garrett and his bad back and his tendency to let paperwork pile up until it fell off the desk. "He might have mentioned it," he said carefully. "I might not have been paying adequate attention." "That is a diplomatic way of saying he forgot," Rosa Bell said. "Yes," Ezekiel agreed. "That is what it is." She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before it disappeared. It was a small thing, that almost smile, but it landed somewhere in the center of his chest with the quiet weight of something significant. They came out of the fog near the bottom of the valley, the white wall thinning gradually until the first scattered stars appeared overhead, and then the nearly full moon, and then the familiar dark shape of the town of Redstone Creek spread out below them along the creek, lamplight in a few windows, the rest dark and sleeping. Ezekiel looked at the stars with something approaching reverence. He had never been so glad to see them. He looked at Rosa Bell, who was still watching the sky with her sextant, making a final notation in a small leather-bound journal she had produced from the pocket of her coat. "I owe you my life," he said. She finished her notation and closed the journal. "You owe me a straight answer," she said. "What were you doing alone in those hills at night without telling anyone where you were going?" It was a fair question. It was also the kind of question that implied she already suspected the answer was something other than routine patrol. "The Malone brothers," he said. "You know who they are." "Everyone in 3 counties knows who they are," she said. "Cattle thieves with a possible sideline in robbery. Sheriff Garrett has been trying to serve warrants on them for 4 months. I received information this afternoon that they were camped in the hills east of town," Ezekiel said. "I rode out to confirm the location before organizing a proper posse." "Alone," she said flatly. "It was meant to be reconnaissance only. Into territory you knew had compass problems at night without informing anyone of your destination." She looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "Deputy Sullivan, that is either very brave or very foolish." "There is rarely much distance between the two," he admitted. She studied him for a moment in the moonlight, and he had the unsettling feeling that she was surveying him the same way she surveyed terrain, taking measurements, calculating distances, mapping the landscape of what he was and was not. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was also not entirely unpleasant. "The Malone brothers' camp," she said. "I know where it is." He stared at her. "Excuse me. I surveyed that section of hills 4 weeks ago," she said. "In the course of the survey, I identified a box canyon approximately 2 miles northeast of the ridge you nearly walked off of tonight. Fresh campfire ash, recently cut timber for a lean-to, horse droppings from at least 3 animals." I did not know it was the Malone brothers specifically, but it was clearly a camp that someone wanted hidden. Ezekiel Sullivan stood very still in the moonlight outside Redstone Creek, Colorado, looking at a woman he had met less than 2 hours ago, who had just saved his life and was now casually informing him that she had located a fugitive camp during a routine surveying expedition. He was not a man who was easily surprised. The frontier had largely burned the capacity for surprise out of him. He was surprised. "You would be willing to share that information," he said. "The exact location." "I will do better than that," she said. "I will draw you a map." She was as good as her word. The next morning, she appeared at the sheriff's office at 8 o'clock with a rolled sheet of paper under her arm and that same straight-backed certainty in her bearing. And she spread the map on Sheriff Garrett's desk and explained, with the patient precision of someone who had spent a lot of time explaining complex things to people who were not quite following, exactly where the box canyon was, what the approach terrain looked like, which trails would give a posse good cover, and which would expose them on open ground. Tom Garrett, who was 62 years old and had been a lawman for 30 of those years and was not accustomed to being educated by anyone, let alone a young woman with a roll of paper, sat back in his chair and looked at the map with his reading glasses on and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "This is the best map I have ever seen." "I know," Rosa Bell said, without any particular arrogance, just the quiet confidence of someone stating a fact. Ezekiel, watching from his post by the window where he had been pretending to look at the street, turned back into the room and caught the edge of Tom Garrett's expression, which was the expression of a man who had just been comprehensively outmaneuvered and was not sure how to feel about it. "We will ride out this afternoon," Garrett said. "Me, Sullivan, and the Harker boys. 4 of us should be enough if the intel is right." "The intel is right," Rosa Bell said. She rolled the map back up and left it on the desk and walked out of the sheriff's office without looking back. Ezekiel watched her go and then became aware that Tom Garrett was watching him watch her go, with the particular expression of an old man who has seen this exact situation before and finds it mildly amusing. "Close your mouth, son," Garrett said. "I was not staring," Ezekiel said. "You absolutely were," Garrett said, and picked up the map. The arrest of the Malone brothers went exactly as Rosa Bell's map predicted it would. The posse approached through the eastern draw. The box canyon was where she said it was. The Linta was where she said it was. And the 3 Malone brothers, 2 of them asleep and 1 tending a cooking fire, were apprehended without a single shot fired. 4 outstanding warrants served. 4 months of failed attempts ended in an afternoon because a woman with a sextant and a leather journal had happened to survey the right section of hills 4 weeks ago. Ezekiel did not see Rosa Bell again for 3 days after that. He was occupied with processing the prisoners and the paperwork that came with it, and she was, according to Clarence Marsh at the general store, out on a 3-day survey expedition in the northern section of the valley for a mining company out of Denver. He found himself noticing her absence in a way he did not care to examine too closely. On the 4th day, he went to the general store with the ostensible purpose of buying coffee and the actual purpose of finding out when she was expected back. She was already back. He found her in the shed behind the store, which she had fitted out as a combination workshop, an office with a drafting table and shelves of books and instruments, and the particular organized chaos of a working mind. She was bent over a large sheet of paper making precise marks with a drafting compass, and she did not look up when he knocked on the open door. "Coffee is 50 cents a pound," she said, "and Clarence has it on the counter." "I did not come for coffee," he said. She looked up. Something moved in her expression too quickly for him to catalog. She set down the drafting compass and straightened. "Deputy Sullivan." "Ezekiel," he said, "please. After what happened the other night, the formality seems misplaced." She considered this for a moment. "Ezekiel," she agreed. "What can I do for you?" He had planned a speech. He had rehearsed it, which was not something he normally did, not something he had done in years. He had planned to be smooth and professional about it, to thank her formally for her assistance on behalf of the sheriff's office, to perhaps mention that her expertise had proved invaluable, and that they might have occasion to call on her services again, all perfectly reasonable and entirely designed to give him an excuse to be standing in her doorway. He abandoned the speech. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "You saved my life. And then you helped us bring in men who have been evading justice for the better part of a year. I wanted to say that to your face, not through Sheriff Garrett and not through Clarence Marsh." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are welcome," she said, "properly." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but waited, expectant. "Also," he said, "I was wondering if you would have dinner with me." The silence shifted. Something in her expression became more careful, more considered, like a woman who has been asked a straightforward question and is calculating the full geometry of the answer before she commits to one. "Why?" she said. He blinked. It was not the response he had anticipated. "Because I would like to have dinner with you." "That is a circular answer," she said. "You are asking me to dinner because you want to have dinner with me. I am asking why you want to have dinner with me." "Because you are the most interesting person I have met in 3 years," he said, and it came out with more honesty than he had intended, stripped of all the careful management he usually applied to his own feelings. He heard it land between them and resisted the impulse to walk it back. Rosa Bell's expression shifted, and this time he caught the full shape of it. Not discomfort, not dismissal. A kind of careful, contained pleasure, the expression of someone who has received an honest thing and is deciding what to do with it. "Dinner," she said. "At the hotel, or are you cooking?" "The hotel," he said quickly. "Definitely the hotel. I am a terrible cook." "Thursday evening," she said. 6 o'clock. I have a survey deadline on Wednesday that I need to meet first." "Thursday at 6, he agreed. He walked back to the sheriff's office with the particular feeling of a man who has won a small battle and is now acutely aware that the larger campaign has barely begun. It was a feeling he recognized, though he had not felt it in a very long time. It sat in his chest warm and slightly dangerous, the way all important things do. Thursday evening came. He was at the hotel at 5:45. Which he would later recognize as the first irrefutable evidence that something had shifted fundamentally in his carefully managed interior life. She arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, and she was wearing a green dress that he had not expected, not because it was particularly elaborate, but because it was clearly her best dress, and the fact that she was wearing it meant she had thought about this evening enough to dress for it. And that small piece of information went directly to the center of his chest and stayed there. They sat at the corner table, the one that was slightly removed from the main dining room, and they talked. Not the way you talk to be polite, filling silence with words that mean nothing. They talked the way people talk when they have been waiting, without knowing it, for someone with whom genuine conversation was possible. She told him about her father, the merchant sailor, and the charts he had spread on the kitchen table of their Boston house when she was a child, teaching her to read the sky the way other fathers taught their daughters to read books. She told him about the mathematics of celestial navigation, the elegant precision of it, the way the universe itself became a coordinate system if you knew how to read it. She talked about why she had come west, which was not romance or adventure but something more specific. The mineral hills of Colorado were the worst possible environment for conventional surveying, and that meant there was a real problem to be solved, and she had a method that could solve it, and she had wanted to prove that it worked. "You came to the frontier to solve a mathematics problem," Ezekiel said. "I came to the frontier to apply a solution to a problem that needed solving," she said. The mathematics was already solved. The application was the interesting part. Most people would not describe the Colorado mountains as primarily interesting from a mathematical standpoint. Most people are not primarily interested in mathematics, she said. What brought you here? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I needed to be somewhere that required all my attention, he said after a pause. The Army had a use for what I knew and what I was capable of. When I left the Army, I needed to find something else that could use those same things. The frontier law needed men who could think and act at the same time. It was a practical arrangement. She looked at him with those clear, measuring eyes. What are you not saying? He looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, her face was serious and open, and he understood that she had just offered him the same honesty he had offered her in the doorway of her workshop, and that the appropriate response was to receive it with equal directness. I needed to outrun something, he said. I found that staying ahead of it was easier here. Dark past, she said, without drama, just the simple acknowledgement of a category she recognized. Something like that, he said. I have one of those too, she said. Not violent. Just painful. A marriage in Boston to a man who found the mathematics embarrassing and the independence intolerable. It lasted 14 months. The divorce was quieter than the marriage and considerably less painful. He had not expected that. I am sorry, he said. I am not, she said simply. It taught me what I would and would not accept. It clarified things. He understood that completely. Some of the worst periods of a life turn out to be the most instructive. He did not say that out loud because it was the kind of thing that sounded better as an unspoken recognition between two people who have both already lived it. They stayed at the hotel table until the kitchen stopped serving, and the dining room emptied, and the proprietor, a patient man named Mr. Hobbs, began blowing out lamps with the careful deliberateness of a man who did not want to be rude about closing time. Ezekiel walked her back to the general store in the clear Colorado night. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars she navigated by, and he looked up at them with new eyes, understanding now that what had seemed like indifferent light to him was, to her, a coordinate system, a map of the universe laid out in points of fire. It was not a small thing, that shift in perception. It was the kind of shift that changes how you see everything afterward. At the door of the general store, she turned to face him. The lamplight from the window caught the side of her face. He wanted very badly to touch her, and he did not, because it was their first evening together and the impulse was too large for the occasion, and he was not a man who acted on impulses before he had thought them through. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. A pause, the stars overhead, the creek murmuring somewhere in the dark. "Ezekiel," she said, "I am not easy to be with. I have been told that by more than one person. I prioritize my work, and I am opinionated, and I do not manage my own emotional frankness particularly well." "I know," he said. "I sat across from you for 3 hours this evening, and you are not bothered by any of that." "No," he said honestly. "I find all of that considerably more appealing than the alternative." She looked at him for a long moment. "Good night," she said, and went inside. He stood on the step for a moment in the cool night air, and the feeling in his chest was nothing like the careful emptiness he had been managing for years. It was something warmer and more dangerous than that. It was, he acknowledged to himself for the first time, the beginning of something he was not going to be able to control. He was not sure he wanted to. The weeks that followed had a quality he would later try to describe to himself and find inadequate words for. Presence was the closest he could come. The presence of someone who occupied a real space in his thoughts, not an intrusion but a kind of permanent residence. He found himself noting things he knew she would find interesting. He found himself looking for her face when he came out of the sheriff's office onto the main street. He found himself revisiting conversations they had had, not to analyze them, but simply because the act of remembering felt worthwhile. They had dinner again the following week, and the week after that. She brought a star chart to the second dinner and spread it on the table between the plates without apparent self-consciousness. explaining the particular stars she used for the Colorado latitude, pointing out the constellations she had used to guide him out of the fog. And he listened with genuine attention and asked genuine questions, and watched her face transform as she talked about the things she loved. The tight control releasing into something open and bright that was more beautiful than anything else he had seen in a long time. He showed her, in return, the topographic method he had learned in the army, the relationship between contour lines and actual terrain, the way a flat map could encode the three-dimensional shape of the Earth if you knew how to read it. She already understood it, of course, better than he did in most respects, but she listened to his version of it with the same genuine attention he had given hers, and that attention, that mutual willingness to be interested in what the other person knew, was something neither of them took for granted. He had not had it before, not like this. The women he had known before Rosa Bell had been, without exception, people he had treated well and felt genuine warmth for, but never this particular connection, this sense of recognition, as if he had been looking at a map of the territory his whole life, and she was the person who had told him what the elevation lines actually meant. He was aware, as the weeks became a month and then two, that he was falling in love with her. He was aware of it in the way you are aware of a tide coming in, the gradual, inexorable advance that eventually covers all the ground you thought was safe to stand on. He did not fight it. He was past the age of fighting things that were simply true. What he did not know was whether she felt the same. She was warm with him, genuinely warm, the guardedness she showed the rest of the world largely absent in the time they spent together. She laughed with him, sometimes the full, unguarded laugh of someone who has been surprised by something genuinely funny, and those moments were among the best he had experienced in recent memory. She sought him out when she returned from survey expeditions, not obviously but genuinely, appearing at the sheriff's office with a question about trail access or a piece of information about terrain that was relevant to law enforcement and that she could have delivered through Sheriff Garrett but chose to deliver directly to him. But she also kept a careful distance, physical distance, the kind that was about more than convention. She was not a woman who touched casually, and she watched him with those calibrating dark eyes as if she were still taking measurements, still calculating whether the terrain was safe. He understood it. He had the same instinct himself, the same caution born of pain. He did not push. He showed up consistently in the ways he could. He listened. He was honest. He did not pretend to be a simpler man than he was, which was, he suspected, the thing that mattered most to her. It was in November, when the first real cold came down from the mountains and the cottonwoods along the creek went bare, that things shifted. He had ridden out with her on a survey day, not as an escort. She did not need an escort, but because she had mentioned that she was surveying a section of the eastern hills that included the Box Canyon, where the Malone brothers had been arrested, and he had an interest in the terrain there from a law enforcement standpoint, and this was true as far as it went, though both of them were aware that it did not go all the way to explaining why he had rearranged his entire week's schedule to be available on a Tuesday in November. They rode out in the cold, clear morning, and she worked while he held her instruments and watched her read the sky with the sextant and make marks in the journal, and move through the landscape with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent years learning exactly how to do a complex thing, and now does it with an economy of motion that looks effortless from the outside. He did something he rarely did. He watched and did not speak. There is a quality to watching a person do the thing they are best at, the thing they have devoted themselves to, that is different from watching someone perform. Performance is for the audience. Mastery is not. Mastery is the person and the work in a direct conversation that the watcher is not quite part of but can feel the truth of from a distance. He watched Rosa Bell read the November sky in the high Colorado hills and felt the truth of her mastery with something close to reverence. He understood, watching her, what it was that had drawn him to her beyond the obvious things. She was completely herself. Not a fraction of herself, not the managed version that most people, including himself, presented to the world, but the full thing, out here in the cold hills with her sextant and her journal and no one to perform for. She was exactly what she was, no apology, no management, no hidden agenda. In a life that had been full of hidden motives and dark corners and people who turned out to be something other than what they presented, that quality in her was, to him, the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered. On the ride back, as the afternoon light went golden and long across the valley, she said, "You have been very quiet today." "I was watching you work," he said. And he looked at her profile against the autumn hills. "I was thinking that you are the most complete person I have ever met," he said. "There are not hidden pieces of you that contradict the visible ones. What you show is what you are." She was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved at an easy walk. The cottonwood trees along the creek threw long shadows across the trail. "That is the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, and her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before. Not performance, not the careful management she usually applied to her own feelings, just the simple, direct sound of someone who has been seen and is not entirely sure how to manage that fact. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand where it rested on the pommel. Her fingers curled around his, and that was all that happened. No declaration, no dramatic moment, just two people on horseback in the Colorado autumn, holding hands in the long golden light, and it was one of the most significant moments of his life. They rode back to Redstone Creek holding hands, and when they parted at the stable he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and she let him. December came, and with it the complications. The complication had a name. It was Marcus Webb, and he was a land agent out of Denver who arrived in Redstone Creek on the second Tuesday of December with a letter of introduction and a pleasant manner, and an interest in Rosa Bell's surveys that had all the surface appearance of professional inquiry and all the underlying character of something considerably darker. Webb was representing a consortium of Denver investors who had identified the Redstone Creek Valley as a potential target for large-scale silver mining development. The surveys Rosa Bell had done were the most accurate representations of the valley's geology available anywhere, and the consortium wanted them. Not to pay for them, not to commission new ones. They wanted to acquire the originals, all of them, along with the mathematical models and navigational methods she had used to create them. They wanted to own the methodology itself. Rosa Bell told Marcus Webb, in terms that left no ambiguity about her position, that her work was not for sale, that the methodology was hers, and that he should convey that information to his employers in Denver and not trouble her further on the subject. Webb was pleasant about it and went away, and then came back 2 days later with a different kind of pleasantness, the kind that has a specific shape of threat underneath it. Ezekiel found out about the second visit from Clarence Marsh, who had overheard the conversation through the shed wall with the particular attentiveness of a man who is protective of the tenant above his store. He went directly to the shed and knocked on the door and found Rosa Bell at her drafting table with the expression of someone who is holding themselves very still in the aftermath of something that has shaken them. "Tell me what he said," Ezekiel said. She told him. Webb had suggested, with the polished language of a man who is careful about how threats are phrased, that the consortium had legal resources that she might find inconvenient, that there were questions about the provenance of her methodology, and that it would be simplest for everyone if she agreed to a reasonable arrangement. He implied they could challenge the ownership of my methods, she said. Claim they were derivative of something his investors' organization had prior claimed to. It is completely without merit, but litigation is expensive and these are wealthy men. He is trying to force a choice, Ezekiel said. Sell cheaply or spend everything you have defending against a fraudulent claim. Yes, she said, that is the trap. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. Where is Webb staying? Ezekiel, she said, I do not need you to confront him on my behalf. I know you do not need me to, he said. I am asking where he is staying because I want to make it clear to him, in my professional capacity as a deputy, that using the threat of litigation as a coercive tool to force an unfair transaction has specific legal implications in this county, and that Sheriff Garrett and I have a great deal of patience for addressing such implications. She looked at him. That is very precisely worded. I have been thinking it through, he said. Something in her expression softened. He is at the hotel, she said. Room 4. The conversation Ezekiel had with Marcus Webb in the hotel corridor was, by Ezekiel's account, a professional exchange of information. Webb was informed of the relevant statutes. Webb was made aware that the sheriff's office had taken an interest in the situation. Webb's pleasant manner became considerably less pleasant, and then became very careful, and then became the manner of a man who was calculating whether his employer's interests were worth the specific kind of trouble that a 6-foot frontier deputy with very steady eyes was implying would come his way. Webb left Redstone Creek on the stage the following morning. Rosa Bell appeared at the sheriff's office that afternoon. Ezekiel was the only one there. Tom Garrett had gone home early with his back. She came in and closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of the room looking at him with an expression that was not the careful, calibrating expression he was accustomed to, but something else entirely, something open and direct and decided. "You went to see him," she said. "Professionally," he said. "Of course," she said. "Ezekiel." "Rosa Bell," he said. She crossed the room and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the first, cautious overture of someone who is not sure how the gesture will be received. It was the kiss of a woman who has thought about this, has made her calculations and reached her conclusion, and acted on it with the same decisive certainty with which she did everything else she did. It was, he would later think, the most perfectly Rosa Bell thing she had ever done in his presence. He kissed her back with equal certainty, his hands coming up to frame her face, and the warmth he had been carrying in his chest for 3 months became something larger and more undeniable that filled the sheriff's office and the cold December afternoon outside it, and he was fairly sure, the entire valley. When they broke apart, she looked at him with those coffee-dark eyes from very close and said, "I have been wanting to do that since about 6 weeks ago, and I have been performing the most elaborate series of calculations to determine whether it was a wise course of action." "And your conclusion," he said, his hand still in her hair. "The mathematics strongly support it," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind he had not produced in years, and she laughed too, and they stood together in the sheriff's office in the December afternoon, and it was one of the best moments of either of their lives. Christmas came to Redstone Creek with real snow that year, the kind that settled in thick and white and turned the town into something from a lithograph. All soft edges and lamplight through frosted windows and the clean, cold smell of pine from the mountains. The town strung paper decorations in the hotel dining room and held a Christmas dance that drew people from the surrounding ranches and mining camps. And it was at this dance that Ezekiel Sullivan and Rosa Bell appeared together publicly for the first time, arriving together and dancing together and sitting together at supper. And if the town of Redstone Creek had been uncertain about the nature of their relationship before that evening, it was uncertain no longer. Tom Garrett, who was there with his wife Alina, pulled Ezekiel aside at the punch bowl and said, "It is about time." "It has been 3 months, Ezekiel said. "Exactly," Garrett said. "About time." Alina Garrett, who was a sharp-eyed woman of 58 who had seen her share of human nature, found Rosa Bell by the window where she was watching the dancers and said, "You look happy." Rosa Bell considered this with her usual care. "Yes," she said, "I believe I do." "He is a good man," Alina said. "I have known him 3 years and I have never once seen him be anything less than exactly who he says he is." "I know," Rosa Bell said. "That is the primary reason I am here." Alina smiled. "Also the dancing is not bad," she said. "Also the dancing is not bad," Rosa Bell agreed and smiled, The full, unguarded smile that Ezekiel had spent months coaxing into existence and now appeared regularly and still made his heart do something unreasonable every single time. Winter progressed. The snow deepened. Ezekiel spent his evenings, whenever duty allowed, in the shed behind the general store, which was warmer than it looked because Rosa Bell had installed a small cast-iron stove and banked it with skill, and she would work at her drafting table while he sat in the chair beside the stove with a book or his own paperwork, and they were simply together in the way that people are when being together has become the baseline state of things. She taught him the stars. Not everything, not the full mathematical architecture that she carried in her head, but the practical reading of the sky, the major stars, the navigational constellations, the way Polaris holds still while everything else moves around it. She took him outside on clear January nights and made him identify stars by name, and then describe their bearing relative to landmarks on the horizon. And he applied himself to it with the same systematic focus he had applied to everything else he had ever chosen to learn. And she was, he discovered, a patient and exacting teacher who was visibly pleased when he got something right and completely unsentimental about correcting him when he got something wrong. "North by northwest," he said one clear January night, standing behind her with his arm along hers to sight along her pointing finger at the sky. "Correct," she said. "And the degree?" He considered the star's position relative to Polaris and the horizon line and hazarded a number. "Within 2 degrees," she said. "That is good for a third lesson." He turned her around in the cold dark and kissed her until they were both breathing unsteadily and the January cold became irrelevant. "I am an excellent student," he said against her hair. "You are motivated," she said, pulling back to look at him with the smile that still destroyed him every time. "That is different." He was, by February, having a private conversation with himself that he had been having in various forms since December and had not yet resolved. He was deeply in love with Rosa Bell. He wanted to marry her. He was also acutely aware that marriage, as a concept, carried a complicated history for her, and that the independence she had fought to establish and was continuing to build was not a small thing that he could ask her to risk without being very clear about what he was and was not asking. He wanted to be clear. He wanted to find words that were true. He found them as it happened, not in a planned moment but in an ordinary one. They were sitting in the shed on a February evening, she at her drafting table and he in his chair, when she said, without looking up from her work, "I have been offered a commission in California. A large mining company mapping the mineral terrain of the Sierra Nevada. 6 months of work, possibly a year." He set down his book. The stove ticked quietly. The wind pressed against the shed walls. "That is significant work," he said carefully. "It is," she said. "It would be the largest commission of my career." She set down her pen. She turned to look at him. "It would mean leaving Redstone Creek." "I know what it would mean," he said. "What are you thinking about it?" She looked at him with those clear dark eyes, and in them he could read the full complicated truth. That she wanted the commission, that she wanted it very much, and that it was the wanting him as well that was making the decision complicated in a way it would not have been 6 months ago. That she was not, perhaps, entirely sorry about that complication. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that I have spent several years being very clear about the fact that my work is the center of my life, and that I will not give it up or subordinate it to anyone else's plans or comfort." "I know," he said. "I would not ask you to." "And I am also thinking," she said, "that the past few months have added something to the center of my life that I did not anticipate, and that I am not sure how to weigh these 2 things without feeling that I am betraying one of them." He got out of the chair and crossed the shed and crouched down in front of her drafting table so that they were eye to eye. "Can I tell you what I think?" he said. "Please," she said. "I think you should take the commission," he said. "I think you should go to California and do the best work of your career, because that is what you are built for, and it is what the world needs from you, and it would be a genuine loss if you did not do it." She waited. "I also think," he said, "that I love you, that I am not a passing thing in my own feelings on the subject, and that if you were willing to have me, I would wait for you to come back from California, and then I would ask you to marry me on whatever terms made your life and your work possible. Your name, your methods, your workspace, your independence, all of it. I am not interested in a marriage that asks you to be smaller than you are." She looked at him for a very long time. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. "You have thought about this," she said. "I have thought about almost nothing else for the past 2 months," he admitted. "You would wait 6 months," she said. "Possibly a year." "I would wait considerably longer than that," he said, "if you needed me to." She reached forward and took his face in both her hands, and she kissed him, and then she rested her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a long, quiet moment in the warm shed while the February wind pressed against the walls. "Ask me now," she said softly. "Do not wait. Ask me now before I go to California, so that I am going as a woman who knows what she is coming back to." He felt the full weight of the moment, clear and certain as a star on a cloudless night. "Rosa Bell," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without a single calculation. Just yes, simple and complete and final. They were married in March before she left for California, in the church on the main street of Redstone Creek on a morning when the snow was retreating from the lower slopes, and the first green was appearing along the creek banks, and the sky was the particular blue of early Colorado spring that looks, if you are paying attention, like the beginning of something new. Tom Garrett stood with Ezekiel. Clara Hobbs, the hotel proprietor's wife, who had become something of a friend to Rosa Bell in the months since their arrival in Redstone Creek, stood with her. The church was full, because in a town of that size the marriage of the deputy and the woman surveyor was not a private event regardless of the intentions of the principals, and because the people of Redstone Creek had, over the course of the preceding months, developed a genuine affection for both of them as a pair. Rosa Bell wore a dress that was not green, the green dress she saved for work dinners, but a deep blue that matched the Colorado sky outside the church windows, and she carried a small bundle of early wildflowers that Clara had arranged, and she walked down the aisle of that church with the bearing of a woman who is doing exactly the right thing and knows it. Ezekiel watched her come toward him and felt something in his chest that had been clenched for years simply open, like a fist releasing, like a compass needle finding north. They spoke the vows in the clear morning light, the minister's voice steady and the congregation quiet, and when it was done and they were facing each other with the full solemn fact of it settled between them, he took her hands and she looked at him, and they were both, in the same moment, exactly where they were supposed to be. They had 2 weeks together before she left for California. 2 weeks of mornings in the small house at the edge of town that he had rented for them. A proper house with 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch where you could see the mountains. And evenings by the fire with her books spread around them and her voice reading star calculations aloud, while he made notes in the margin of his own notebook. 2 weeks of learning the particular domestic texture of shared life, the small negotiations and discoveries that you cannot anticipate from the outside, the way she took her coffee strong and without sugar, and the way he could not sleep until he had checked the door was locked, the way she talked through problems by thinking aloud and needed him not to respond until she had finished, the way he woke early and would bring coffee to the bedside table before she opened her eyes. 2 weeks that were, he would later say, the happiest period of his life up to that point. And then she was on the stage heading west, with her 3 trunks of instruments and her books and her journals, and he was standing on the main street of Redstone Creek watching the stage diminish into the distance, and the space where she had been was very large. He filled it with work, because he knew no other way. He did his job, the daily round of it, the routine of a frontier town in the Colorado mountains in the spring of 1883. He wrote to her every week long letters that were not love letters exactly, but were the letters of a man telling the person he loved about the daily texture of his life, the small events and the landscape, and the things he noticed that he knew she would find interesting. She wrote back in the same mode, factual and specific, and between the facts he could always read the larger thing, the sense of her mind and her presence, the warmth she did not express directly but that lived in the selection of what she chose to share. She was gone 6 months, not a year. The commission went faster than expected because she worked faster than anyone had anticipated, producing surveys of the Sierra Nevada mineral terrain that were, by all accounts, years ahead of anything that had been done in that region, using her celestial navigation methods in the mountain terrain with the same precision she had applied in Colorado. She came back to Redstone Creek in September, arriving on the stage on an afternoon when the aspens had just turned, and the hills were burning with gold. Ezekiel was at the stage stop waiting because Clara Hobbs had told him which stage, Clara being in correspondence with Rosa Bell, in a way that had clearly been coordinated to ensure he would be there. She stepped off the stage and he was there, and she walked directly into his arms, something she had never quite done before, not in that uncalculated, immediate way, and he held her in the middle of the stage stop yard with the September aspens gold around them, and the feeling in his chest was so large and complete that he was not sure the word for it was love. Love seemed small for what this was, but it was the closest word available. "The Sierra Nevada is magnificent," she said, her face against his shoulder. "But Colorado is home." "Yes," he said, "it is." They walked through the golden September town to the house at the edge with the mountain view, and she was home, and that was the fact of it, complete and settled. That winter was different from the previous one. The warmth of the house was different when she was in it. The evenings by the fire were different. Not because the external facts had changed, the same stove, the same chairs, the same coffee and books and star conversations, but because the element that gave all those things their meaning was present and could be relied upon. And there is a particular quality to the reliability of the person who matters most to you that cannot be replicated by anything else. She continued her work. She took commissions in the spring, shorter ones now, 2 weeks or 3, never more than a month, and she returned between them to Redstone Creek and to Ezekiel and to the house with the mountain view, and the work and the life together found a rhythm that suited both of them. In January of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child. He was, in the moment of her telling him, standing at the kitchen stove with a coffee cup in his hand, and he set the cup down very carefully on the counter and turned to look at her, and she was watching him with that expression he had come to know as her version of vulnerable, the slight openness around the eyes, the stillness of someone waiting for a response that matters. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "In July, approximately." He crossed the kitchen and took her hands and looked at her face. "How do you feel?" he said. "Surprised," she said, "and pleased." "And somewhat terrified, which is not a sensation I have extensive experience with." A pause, "and very pleased." He brought her hands up and kissed them. "So am I," he said. "All of those things." She leaned her forehead against his. "I am not giving up the work," she said. "I would not dream of suggesting it," he said. "The commissions will need to be local for a while," she said, "and shorter." "There is no shortage of local terrain that needs surveying," he said. "You have been saying for 2 years that the western section of the valley is inadequately mapped." "I have been saying that since I arrived," she said. "Then this is your opportunity," he said. "Stay local. Map the western valley, have the baby, continue to be the most accomplished cartographer in Colorado." She laughed, that full, unguarded laugh that still struck him every time. "That is a very practical assessment of the situation." "I am a practical man," he said. "You are a romantic man who disguises it as practicality," she said. He had no convincing argument against this and did not attempt one. July came. The baby came with it, 3 days before the estimated date, as if impatient, which Ezekiel privately thought was consistent with parentage. A boy, solid and healthy, with Rosa Bell's dark eyes and Ezekiel's jaw, born in the house at the edge of town with Clara Hobbs assisting, and the July sun lying golden across the mountain view from the bedroom window. They named him James, after Rosa Bell's father, the merchant sailor who had taught her to read the sky. The naming was Ezekiel's suggestion, and Rosa Bell cried when he made it, quietly and in the way she did everything, with a kind of contained force, and she held his hand very tightly and said the name once out loud, James, and it settled into the house like something that had always been there waiting. James Sullivan grew into a healthy, curious, loudly opinionated boy who inherited his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and seemed to have received all available portions of both his parents' considerable intelligence, which made for a lively household. He walked early, talked early, and at the age of 3 was discovered in Rosa Bell's workshop attempting to open her sextant case, an event that precipitated a serious conversation about asking permission and a less serious one about the appropriate age at which to begin teaching star navigation. "He is 3, Ezekiel said. "My father started teaching me at 4, Rosa Bell said. "1 more year then," Ezekiel said. "He seems ready," she said. "He cannot read yet," Ezekiel said. "Navigation does not require reading," she said. "It requires observation and pattern recognition. He has both." Ezekiel looked at his 3-year-old son, who was looking back at him with Rosa Bell's measuring dark eyes and waiting to see who would win this exchange. "Fine," he said, "but supervised and not the actual sextant yet." "Obviously not yet," she said. "The wooden model first." She had made a wooden model. Of course she had. She had made it over the winter, a detailed wooden replica of her modified sextant, sized for small hands, with the index mirror replaced by polished tin. She produced it from behind the drafting table with the expression of someone who has been planning this for considerably longer than one conversation. Ezekiel looked at the wooden model and then at his wife and then at his son and felt the warm, impossible fullness of a life that contained all these things and said, "You made that months ago." 6 months ago, she agreed, completely unabashed. "You were never going to wait until he could read," Ezekiel said. "No," she said. "But I was willing to have the conversation." He shook his head and laughed, and James, taking this as permission, reached for the wooden sextant with both hands. Ezekiel Sullivan was reappointed as deputy sheriff of Redstone Creek in 1885, and in 1886, when Tom Garrett finally retired to the garden he had been promising a leaner for 20 years, Ezekiel was elected sheriff by a margin that suggested the town of Redstone Creek had formed opinions on the matter considerably in advance of the election. He accepted the badge with the same straightforward acknowledgement with which he approached everything, made no speech, thanked the people who had voted for him, and went directly back to work. Rosa Bell pinned the new badge on his vest herself on the morning of the election results, with the expression of someone who is proud and is not managing it. "Sheriff Sullivan," she said. "It is the same job," he said. "It is not the same job," she said. "The jurisdiction is broader and the authority is clearer, and you can now hire 2 deputies instead of operating as 1. All of which I will address on Monday," he said. "Right now I am more interested in breakfast." "I am making breakfast," she said. "And then I want to show you the new elevation model of the Northern Valley section, which I finished last night and which solves a problem I have been working on for 3 months. "Tell me about the elevation model over breakfast," he said. She did. She always did. The boundary between breakfast and celestial mathematics and love and work had never been particularly clear in their household, and both of them preferred it that way. The following spring, Rosa Bell informed him that James was going to have a sibling. This time she told him in the evening, sitting by the fire, and he was not holding a coffee cup, so there was nothing to set down carefully. He simply took her hand and held it. "Also July, it seems," she said. "I appear to be a summer person." "How do you feel?" "Very well," she said. "Better than last time, actually, more settled, less terrified." "You were terrified last time," he said with genuine surprise. "I told you I was," she said. "You told me you were somewhat terrified," he said. "You did not seem terrified." "I am quite good at not seeming what I am," she said. "You of all people should know that." He considered this. "What do you seem now?" "Happy," she said directly. I seem happy because I am happy, and I have gotten better in the past 4 years at letting those two things coincide. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles. So have I, he said. This time it was a girl, born on a golden August morning with considerably more urgency than James had managed, arriving early and loud, with a shock of dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and an expression from the first moments that suggested she intended to have strong opinions about everything. They named her Catherine, after Ezekiel's mother, a woman who had been dead 12 years, and who Ezekiel had loved without fully articulating it until she was gone, as people do. Rosa Bell had insisted on the name when Ezekiel had mentioned it tentatively, saying that the hesitance in his voice when he offered it told her everything she needed to know about how much it mattered, and that she would be very pleased to have a daughter named for someone her husband had loved. James, at 4 years old, regarded his new sister with the scientific interest of a child who had been prepared for her arrival by careful parental explanation, and was now collecting data on how closely the reality matched the theoretical model. He concluded, after 3 days of observation, that she was loud but interesting, which Rosa Bell recorded in the journal she kept of both children with the same precise handwriting she used for survey notes. Redstone Creek grew through the late 1880s. The silver boom found new veins and the town expanded, and a second hotel was built, and the school added a second teacher, and the stage ran twice a week instead of once. Rosa Bell's work grew with the town, her reputation extending well beyond the three-county area now, her methods adopted by surveyors as far east as Kansas and as far west as the California coast, where the mining companies who had employed her had shared her techniques with colleagues, and the techniques had propagated outward with the particular momentum of genuinely good ideas. She was offered in 1888 a faculty position at a university in Denver. A new science of applied geography, which was essentially what she had been developing and practicing for a decade, and which the university intended to formalize into a curriculum, and they wanted her to teach it. She brought the letter to Ezekiel on a Tuesday evening and put it on the table in front of him without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. Denver, he said. 3 days a week, she said. The teaching schedule would be Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I could take the Monday stage and return on the Friday evening stage. 3 days in Denver, 4 days here, he said. Yes, she sat down across from him. The children would be here, you would be here. I would be here 4 days of the week, and 3 days you would be in Denver teaching the method to the next generation of people who will use it, he said. She looked at him with those clear dark eyes. Yes, he thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to be sure he was being honest with himself and not managing the answer to fit what she wanted to hear. You should do it, he said. This is precisely the kind of position that should exist and precisely the kind of person who should fill it. It will be complicated, she said, for the household, for the children. Clara Hobbs has been telling me for 3 years that she would happily help with the children any time we needed it, he said. We have needed it less than she expected, and she has made clear she considers this a deprivation. This will address that. Rosa Bell smiled. You have already thought this through. I saw the letter before you brought it to me, he admitted. She stared at him. You opened my correspondence. It was on the doorstep and it was from the University of Denver and it was unsealed, he said. The envelope had come open in transit. Had it, she said. The flap was not fully adhered, he said, with the expression of a man who is committing fully to his account of events. She looked at him for a long moment and then the smile became the laugh, the full one, and he leaned across the table and kissed her. Take the position, he said. She did. The arrangement was, as these things sometimes are, more complicated in practice than it was in planning. The first months required adjustments, a recalibration of the household rhythms, negotiations with Clara Hobbs, who was, as promised, enthusiastic and capable, and occasionally so enthusiastic in her management of James and Catherine that Ezekiel came home on Wednesday evenings, to find them having been given considerably more sugar than their parents' dietary philosophy suggested was appropriate. James, at 7, was old enough to navigate the weekly transitions with equanimity. Catherine, at 3, required more consistency and some creative management, but she was, like her mother, fundamentally adaptable beneath the surface stubbornness. And by the 3rd month she had incorporated the weekly rhythm into her understanding of the world as simply how things were. Rosa Bell returned from Denver every Friday evening on the late stage and arrived at the house at the edge of town to find supper on the table, which Ezekiel had, over the preceding 4 years, become considerably better at producing, and the children, bathed and in their night clothes, waiting with the particular energy of small people who have been managing their excitement all day. The reunions were, consistently, among his favorite hours of the week. On a Friday evening in October of 1889, a year into the Denver arrangement, Rosa Bell arrived home to find the house decorated with autumn leaves that James had collected and arranged with the systematic thoroughness of a child who has clearly received more than his fair share of his parents' organizational tendencies, and Catherine asleep already, having exhausted herself waiting, and Ezekiel at the kitchen stove with the supper that had been ready for 20 minutes, but had been kept warm with the specific skill of a man who has learned that stages run late, but suppers should still be hot. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it, the decorated house and the sleeping child and the supper and the man at the stove who had turned to look at her when she came in, and the expression on her face was not the careful, calibrated expression that had been her primary mode when he first met her, but something more open and settled than that. "What?" he said, reading something in her face. "Nothing," she said. "Just this." He understood. He carried the same feeling every day. The specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of a life that was genuinely what it appeared to be, built on honesty and mutual respect, and the particular love that comes from being known completely by another person and found worth knowing. He served the supper. James appeared from his room, having not been asleep at all, and was allowed to stay up for the meal on the grounds that it was Friday, and the rule about Friday was that supper was a family affair regardless of the hour. The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and the mountains were dark shapes against the Colorado sky outside the window, and the stars were out, and somewhere in the shed behind the general store where it had all begun, the drafting table still held the latest survey in progress, and the sextant was in its case, and the coordinates of the stars were exactly where they had always been. James, at 7, had graduated from the wooden model to the actual sextant the previous spring, and could already identify 14 named stars and calculate a rough bearing from 3 of them. He talked about this at supper with the enthusiasm of a child who has discovered that the sky is not merely decorative, but is instead a vast and readable map. And Rosa Bell answered his questions and corrected his terminology with the patient exactness of a teacher who considers this particular student her finest project. And Ezekiel listened to both of them, and Catherine ate her supper and reached periodically across the table to put her small hand on top of his hand for no apparent reason. Just the comfortable physical claim of a small child on a parent, and he covered her hand with his, and the October night settled around the house, and the lamp burned warmly, and the mountains stood watch outside, and this was the shape of his life. Not the life he had planned, because he had not been capable, at any point before this life began, of planning something this complete, but the life that had arrived, specifically and precisely, because he had ridden out into the fog-covered hills of Redstone Creek, Colorado, on a September night in 1882 without a compass, and had been found. The fog that had threatened to end him had given him everything instead. The cold dark of that mountain night had been the terrain across which he had first heard Rosa Bell's voice, clear and certain, and aimed directly at the part of him that had needed, more than anything, to be told where he was and which way to go, and that someone capable had seen him in the white blankness, and was not going to let him walk off the edge. He thought about that night sometimes, the fog and the spinning compass and the ridge that would have ended him, and about the woman who had emerged from the white wall with a sextant and a journal and more knowledge in her head than he possessed in his whole body, and who had guided him back to safety in the literal sense. And then, over the years that followed, in every sense there was. He had been lost without a compass, and she had been his navigation, not because she had taken over the journey but because she had taught him to read the sky. On the morning of their 8th wedding anniversary, he woke early in the March cold, the way he always did, and brought coffee to the bedside table, the way he always did, and sat on the edge of the bed watching Rosa Bell sleep with the specific attention of a man who has never stopped finding his wife worth looking at. She opened her eyes and looked at him and said, without preamble, in the voice of someone who has been half awake for longer than she was indicating, 8 years. 8 years, he agreed. When I walked into that fog in September 1882, she said, I was performing an atmospheric temperature inversion study. I had no intention of finding anyone. I had no intention of needing to be found, he said. She pushed herself up against the pillows and accepted the coffee. The March morning was gray and cold outside the window, the mountains white with late snow, the sky the particular flat silver of a day that might clear or might not. She looked at it with the assessing gaze of a woman who reads weather the same way she reads stars. It will clear by afternoon, she said. Will it? He said. The cloud base is high, she said. Wind is from the southwest. By midday at the latest. She looked at him. We should take the children to the ridge this afternoon. The visibility after a clearing like this is extraordinary. I want to show James the winter constellations from that elevation. The ridge where you stopped me from walking off it, he said. That is the one, she said. It has good sky exposure to the south, ideal for the winter constellations. He looked at her, his wife of 8 years, the woman who had saved his life and built a life with him, who taught the mathematics of the stars to university students in Denver and to their 7-year-old son in the Colorado hills, who had never once in 8 years been less than exactly who she was, who had given him the extraordinary gift of being known and accepted in the full complicated fact of himself. I love you, he said. I want to state that plainly and without mathematical justification. She smiled, the full one, the one that was only ever entirely for him. I love you, she said, equally plain. Though for what it is worth, the mathematical justification is substantial. He took the coffee cup from her hands and set it on the bedside table and kissed her in the gray March morning. And outside the window the clouds were beginning already to break open in the southwest, exactly as she had predicted they would, letting the first pale light of the approaching clear day come through. By afternoon the sky over Redstone Creek was a brilliant, washed Colorado blue, the kind that comes after weather has passed through, and the 4 of them, the sheriff and the cartographer and the boy who was learning to read stars and the girl who had strong opinions about everything, climbed the trail to the ridge that Rosa Bell had once stopped a half-lost deputy from walking off, and stood on the high ground with the whole valley spread out below them and the winter sky beginning to emerge above them. James had his wooden model sextant. He did not need it for the stars yet, they would come with the dark, but he carried it because it was his, and because he was his mother's son, and he liked to hold the instrument of his education in his hands while he was learning. Catherine had a biscuit from lunch that she had been saving in her coat pocket with the focused dedication of a child who does not believe in waste. She ate it on the ridge and looked out over the valley with the gray eyes she had inherited from her father, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who is very small and the world is very large, and this fact is, upon consideration, mostly wonderful. Ezekiel stood behind Rosa Bell with his arms around her, both of them looking out over the valley that she had surveyed, and he had kept the peace of for more than a decade. And the late afternoon light was the warm slanted gold of a Colorado winter that is thinking about becoming spring. And Redstone Creek was down there in the valley, solid and real, the church and the hotel and the sheriff's office, and the shed behind the general store where it had all begun. She tilted her head back against his shoulder and looked up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear in the east, faint and then brighter, as the blue deepened toward the deep velvet of real night. "There," she said. "Polaris, low on the north horizon." He looked. He found it. North, always steady, the one star that held its position while everything else wheeled around it. He had come to understand, in the years since she had taught it to him, why navigators placed such faith in the fixed point. The world was full of spinning compasses and disorienting fogs and terrain that swallowed you whole if you were not paying attention. The fixed point was the thing you came back to. The thing that told you with complete reliability where you were. He tightened his arms around his wife. She settled against him with the comfortable certainty of a woman who knows where she is. North. True north. After everything, after the fog and the dark past and the forced choices and the careful distance he had kept from everything that mattered for so many years, he had found his fixed point. She had found him first in the fog, because she always knew where she was going. And Redstone Creek lay below them in the early dark, lamp by lamp coming alight along the creek and the main street and the houses at the edges of things. And the stars were coming out in their full winter array, bright and faithful and everywhere. The great coordinate system of the sky that Rosa Bell had read her whole life, and that she had taught him to read too. And James beside them was raising his wooden sextant to his eye with the focused concentration of a 7-year-old who intends to master this the way he has been taught to master everything. And Catherine was brushing biscuit crumbs off her coat with an air of satisfaction. The fog was long gone. The compass had not been needed in years. The fixed stars were exactly where they had always been. Everything, at last, was found.